They may not be as necessary to a franchise as some others, but these sequels are definitely worth watching. And if you haven't heard of them, you aren't alone. These are the best movie sequels you've never watched. Few films have had an impact as great as 1939's The Wizard of Oz. Adapted from L. Frank Baum's novel The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, not only was the film representative of the height of technology, but it confirmed Judy Garland as a bona fide star. The Wizard of Oz was nominated for 6 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, and according to the Library of Congress, it's been watched more than any other movie. Critically beloved, it's a true American classic that continues to have an impact on audiences today. 45 years later, Return to Oz finds young Dorothy Gale, now played by Fairuza Balk, on a new adventure back to Oz, only this trip is much, much darker. Gone are the friendly residents of Munchkinland and the familiar faces that belong to Dorothy's Yellow Brick Road companions. Emerald City lies in ruins, overrun by the appropriately named Wheelers, creatures with wheels for hands and feet.
Come here, chicken!
To say that Return to Oz is a strange second serving would be an understatement. The movie has little to do with its predecessor outside of its central, decidedly less musical heroine. It came in 7th at the box office its opening weekend, bringing in less than $3 million on a $28 million budget. Critics were split, with many noting its darker tone as either its most positive or most negative attribute. Still, it's attracted a cult following in the years since its release. And if a princess with a collection of heads is more your speed than a wicked witch with flying monkeys, Return to Oz is certainly a worthwhile endeavor. Brian De Palma's 1976 horror classic Carrie marked the first of many Stephen King adaptations. The story of teenage outcast Carrie White, who discovers she has telekinetic abilities to a murderous degree. Carrie is generally regarded as one of, if not the best, of King's adaptations, and it's considered to be one of the greatest horror films ever made. It's also gone on to inspire 2 remakes and a sequel, decades after its initial release. While a remake of the horror classic should be expected, a Carrie sequel is something that requires a little more finesse. After all, the original film ends with the teenager's death. It doesn't get much more final than that. Unless, of course, Carrie were to have a secret half-sister with the exact same untapped telekinetic potential, which is the general premise for 1999's The Rage Carrie 2. Starring Emily Bergel as said sibling Rachel Lang, the film follows the same general beats as its predecessor. Members of the in-crowd play the less popular kid for laughs. She loses control of her abilities. Everything and everyone goes to hell. The Rage couldn't impress critics or audiences, and its lasting legacy is as a disposable relic of 90s-era teen horror. But it's an entertaining watch, if for no other reason than the fact that it made an attempt to expand on the original's lore, as opposed to just rehashing it all together. And Bergel is solid as Rachel, who turns out to be a more sympathetic character on account of having at least some measure of social ability. 1996's Trainspotting was an instant hit and a true encapsulation of 90s indie cinema. The portrait of addiction and poverty in suburban Edinburgh, based on Irvin Welsh's same-named novel, centers on a group of heroin-addicted friends led by Mark Renton as they struggle with sobriety and everyday existence. It spoke to an entire generation of lost souls, and its unflinching portrayal of abuse was highlighted by a dark humor and an incredible soundtrack. In 1999, the British Film Institute named Trainspotting the 10th best British film of the century. 2 decades later, the original cast reunited with director Danny Boyle for T2 Trainspotting, which sees Renton return to his old neighborhood as his marriage falls apart, he suffers a heart attack, and the impending doom of middle age looms around the corner.
Choose Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram, and 1,000 other ways to spew your bile across people you've never met.
This go-around, Renton and his pals find themselves caught up in a legal mess revolving around the operation of an illegal brothel. Although T2 performed well internationally, it had a quiet opening in America, bringing in less than $200,000 its first weekend. Still, the film did well with critics, who praised its emotionally resonant portrayal of a group of people struggling to move forward from their past mistakes. It may not be as innovative as its predecessor, but it still speaks to those who grew up with the original and may not yet have completely found their way. In the realm of science fiction, there is perhaps no film more influential than Stanley Kubrick's 1968 masterpiece, 2001: A Space Odyssey. Set largely aboard the Jupiter-bound spacecraft Discovery 1, 2001 tells the story of a mysterious monolith, the group of astronauts sent to investigate it, and the onboard computer system that ultimately turns against them. The film was nominated for 4 Academy Awards, winning 1 for Best Special Visual Effects, and is today regarded as one of the most culturally significant films ever made. It remains a topic of discussion for film fans and scholars alike. Peter Hyam's 1984 follow-up 2010, The Year We Make Contact, was never going to be able to reach the bar that 2001 had set, but it definitely tries. 9 years after the Discovery 1 incident, a joint US-Soviet mission is sent out to uncover the truth. 2010 further explores the presence and meaning of the monolith, although, like 2001, the audience is left with more questions than answers about its true purpose. 2010 did fairly well at the box office, opening in second place with a $7 million haul. Response from critics was overall favorable, but its biggest problem isn't that it's not a good sci-fi movie, it really is. It's that it isn't a Stanley Kubrick sci-fi movie. Taken on its own merits, 2010 turns out to be one of the more enjoyable space set films of the 80s. There's a benefit to following a film that's never been considered a classic or a masterpiece, one that hasn't set any box office or awards records. When expectations are low or non-existent, you can really do anything you want. 1978's Attack of the Killer Tomatoes was no critical darling. The film, about a country besieged by mutated carnivorous tomatoes and the team of specialists tasked with saving the day, has received mostly negative reviews over the years. In spite of this, Attack of the Killer Tomatoes is a bona fide cult classic that's launched an entire franchise of sequels, novels, video games, and kids' cartoons. The approach to its first sequel, 1988's Return of the Killer Tomatoes, was one of the throw everything at the wall and see what sticks variety. A decade after the Great Tomato War, tomatoes have been outlawed. Everything seems to be going well until Professor Mortimer Gangrene, the never-spoken-of true villain behind the film's first attack, figures out a way to reverse engineer the music that brought about his initial defeat to his favor, transforming tomatoes into human beings. Our heroes in this installment are Pizza Boy Chad, tomato-turned-human Tara, Chad's best friend Matt, and a poorly mutated tomato named FT. Like its predecessor, Return of the Killer Tomatoes is completely ridiculous. But where Attack of the Killer Tomatoes is just a parody of B-movies, Return of the Killer Tomatoes is a parody of a parody, which somehow makes it a better film. From fourth wall breaking to unnecessary product placement and fuzzy mutated pet adventures, it's beyond anything in its genre, which is a good thing. The Star Trek franchise is vast and long-running, one that follows multiple crews and which has lasted more than half a century. Since 1979, 13 Star Trek films have been made, although only 3 crews have made it to the big screen. 2 if we're counting the J.J. Abrams alternate timeline 1 as just a variation of the original. The film series has had its fair share of ups and downs, and while one might assume an 8th film would have a difficult time standing up against some of its predecessors, 1996's Star Trek First Contact managed to take everyone by surprise.
I bring order to chaos.
The follow-up to 1994's Generations, which effectively passed the motion picture torch from Kirk's Enterprise to Picard's, First Contact is the first of the Star Trek films to focus solely on the Next Generation crew. It also revisits one of its greatest storylines, the battle with the Borg. Years after Picard's assimilation into and escape from the Collective, a new Borg threat sends the crew of the Enterprise back in time to save Earth from mass assimilation. First Contact has been hailed as one of the best films in the entire series, with critics praising both the film's performances and its direction, which comes courtesy of number one himself, Jonathan Frakes. It's a truly interesting, updated take on the story, and having a big screen budget to tell it definitely works to the film's benefit. By 2011, the world had grown weary of Sidney Prescott and her seemingly never-ending parade of obsessed, mask-wearing murderous psychos. Scream 3, which hit theaters in 2000, was panned by critics, who claimed the film fell back on the same old cliches the franchise had once destroyed. Still, it managed to nearly make up for its entire cost its first weekend at the box office, so the studio system trudged forward, greenlighting a fourth installment in the franchise. Hopes for greatness weren't exactly high, but Scream 4 turned out to be more than just a passable sequel. Returning to its roots, the film features two Ghostface killers working in tandem: Jill Roberts, Sidney's jealous, fame-hungry cousin, and Charlie Walker, Jill's secret boyfriend and horror movie aficionado. The rules, however, have changed. In this Scream installment, we find the killers are adhering to movie remake rules.
Modern audiences get savvy to the rules of the originals, so the reversals become the new standard.
It's a small change from the franchise's original formula, but it's enough to make this particular sequel stand out. Having killer stars Emma Roberts and Rory Culkin inject some much-needed fresh blood into the franchise is an added bonus. Their performances are what ultimately makes the movie, and it's fun to check out Roberts play with villainy prior to her memorable turn on American Horror Story Coven. When it hit theaters in 1978, no one suspected that John Carpenter's Halloween, a low-budget slasher about a boogeyman in a spray-painted Captain Kirk mask and mechanic's overalls who stalks a babysitter and kills all her friends along the way, would become the phenomenon it did. The film set the stage for what much of horror would go on to look like in the following years, and since it's become not only a classic, but required viewing for anyone even remotely interested in the genre. Michael Myers is an icon, and it's hard to imagine the world of Halloween movies without him. But it wasn't always meant to be this way. Carpenter's intention was to have the Michael Myers story end with the first film. After its success, Carpenter, quote, had to write the sequel, but as he explained to The Hollywood Reporter in 2015, "I thought that we were done with telling stories about Michael Myers and the guy in the mask. I thought there's not much more to say. So, we thought we'd come up with a new story every year. We could call it Halloween, but it didn't have to do anything with Michael Myers." And so in 1982, we got Halloween 3: Season of the Witch, a film that swaps out Michael Myers for a piece of Stonehenge and some cursed Halloween masks, and which tells the story of one man's plot to sacrifice a bunch of children in order to bring about a new age of witchcraft. Halloween 3 may not have been a hit with critics who'd expected another Michael Myers installment, but it's since developed its own fanbase, one that doesn't need a masked maniac at Halloween. There's no denying the overwhelming appeal of 1984's horror comedy Gremlins. Centered on a family who unwittingly unleashes a horde of mischievous monsters upon the small town of Kingston Falls, Gremlins combines holiday fantasy with outright terror, taking on a consumer culture with a little water and some sunlight. It proved to be a massive hit, raking in over $12 million its opening weekend. A few years later, the cast and crew reunited, and hoping to strike gold twice, Gremlins 2: The New Batch hit theaters in June of 1990. While the basic premise of the original story is here, for the most part, Gremlins 2 is a movie all its own. Both films are horror comedies, But Gremlins 2 takes the story in a more light-hearted direction than its predecessor, relying more on parody for laughs. It's over the top in its comedic excess. Joe Dante, who directed both films, told Bloody Disgusting in 2015 that he never wanted to make a sequel but was given, quote, 3 times the money, along with the freedom to do whatever he wanted. He explained, "So I made Gremlins 2, which was essentially about how there didn't need to be a sequel to Gremlins."
I can't believe this. I mean, this is worse than the first one.
We just show these movies, madam. We don't make them.
Regardless of how it came to be, Gremlins 2 is one of those sequels that fans should hold as near and dear to their hearts as the original, even if it is just making fun of itself the entire time. Demonic possession has served as Hollywood horror fodder for decades. The most famous of these films is, of course, 1973's The Exorcist. William Friedkin takes on William Peter Blatty's 1971 novel that centers on Regan, a young girl who falls under the control of a demon named Pazuzu, and on Father Damien Karras, a priest struggling with his faith who's tasked with saving her. The film wound up being a hit at the box office, raking in nearly $200 million domestically, and it became the first horror movie to be nominated for Best Picture at the Academy Awards. Obviously, there was a market for Pazuzu, and in 1977, he and Regan made a comeback with The Exorcist II: The Heretic. That film, which attempted to expand upon the demonic lore of the first with psychic healers and doppelgangers, was a failure both critically and financially. But in 1990, Blatty returned to the franchise, serving as both writer and director of The Exorcist III. Ignoring the events of The Heretic, The Exorcist III follows William Kinderman, a police lieutenant, investigating a series of deaths that look like those committed by a now-dead serial killer. Jason Miller reprises his role as Karras, who, after having survived the Reagan exorcism, is now being used as a killer conduit. While not without its faults, The Exorcist III is a vast improvement on its predecessor. It's thoughtful, and both Scott and Miller are exceptional. In an unfortunate turn of events, however, Blatty was forced to add an exorcism sequence to the end, forever marring a film that would have otherwise been a haunting and cerebral follow-up worthy of his original. When Wes Craven's A Nightmare on Elm Street hit theaters in 1984, it was like nothing horror fans had ever seen before. A killer targeting teens in their dreams, a community of adults behind a massive cover-up, and a villain so terrifying that he kept both the film's characters and its audience awake at night. Robert Englund built his entire career around Freddy Krueger, a role he credits for making him, quote, an international actor overnight. And since first donning that knifed glove, he's gone on to play the killer 7 more times. As the franchise went on, however, it became a parody of itself, and Freddy was relegated to little more than a caricature. But Craven always was the kind of writer-director who thrived on turning things on their head. And, like he did with the horror genre in 1984, he flipped the narrative of his original masterpiece a decade later with Wes Craven's New Nightmare, reuniting original cast members as real-life versions of themselves who wind up terrorized by a demonic force posing as Freddy Krueger. New Nightmare has almost nothing to do with the original Nightmare on Elm Street narrative. Instead, it examines the horror industry itself, as well as the legacy of Craven's original film and the franchise it created.
But the problem comes when the story dies. And that can happen in a lot of ways. It can get too familiar to people, or somebody waters it down to make it an easier sell.
It's meta at its very best, and it in fact serves as a sort of warm-up to Craven's 1996 hit Scream. The approach proves successful with both critics and audiences. Wes Craven's New Nightmare is considered one of the best in the entire series, second only to the original. Comedies in the early aughts were often over-the-top, raunchy, and ridiculous. Stoner comedies, which were exceptionally popular at the time, were all of these things, but with an added layer of unlikely drug-induced hijinks. Enter Harold and Kumar Go to White Castle, a 2004 film that follows the titular characters on a pot-fueled quest to satiate their late-night munchies. The pair are thrust into a series of misadventures but ultimately find their way, thanks in part to Neil Patrick Harris. While not an Oscar contender by any means, Harold and Kumar Go to White Castle received generally favorable reviews upon its release, mostly on account of its likable leads and edgy humor. Although its 2008 follow-up, Harold and Kumar Escape from Guantanamo Bay, was decidedly less successful, John Cho and Kal Penn reunited once more in 2011 for A Very Harold and Kumar Christmas, a 3D holiday film that revisits the duo 2 years after having gone their separate ways. Like the films that came before it, A Very Harold and Kumar Christmas tends toward lowbrow humor, but not at all to the extent that Guantanamo Bay did. Instead, Christmas leans into the holiday spirit, tempering its crass comedy with genuine feel-good moments. That isn't to say that it will ever become a holiday classic, but it's an entertaining final installment to a franchise that understood when it was time to say goodbye. There's much to be said for Robert Zemeckis' 1985 time travel comedy Back to the Future, telling the story of high schooler Marty McFly, who, with the help of inventor Doc Brown, travels back in time to save his parents' marriage and his future existence. Back to the Future is, to this day, one of the most beloved and original movies ever made. It was both a critical and financial success, going on to become the highest-grossing film of 1985. It was nominated for 4 Academy Awards, including Best Screenplay, and the New York Times lists it as one of the best 1,000 movies ever made. There are 2 sequels, and while 1989's Back to the Future Part 2 is the one that's remembered most by fans, it's Back to the Future Part 3 that's the forgotten gem of the franchise.
Great Scott!
After learning of Doc's death in 1885 at the hands of Bill Tannen's great-grandfather Mad Dog, Marty travels back to the Old West in order to save him. Part 3 has a much simpler narrative than Part 2, but it's helped along with a fun and interesting setting, a locomotive time machine, and a love interest for Doc that, quite frankly, was well-deserved. The film was also a bigger hit with critics than the prior installment, with the general consensus being that its paring down of plot elements worked in its favor. It may not be the cultural powerhouse that the original is, but it definitely keeps from falling into the franchise trap of unworthy sequels. Check out one of our newest videos right here. Plus, even more Looper videos about your favorite movies are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.